Welcome back to Beach House 34. Tonight, it's part 2 of the MacNeill case. And we're picking up right where we left off in the last episode, kind of the edge of the cliff, so to speak. If you were there with us for part 1, you know exactly where we're standing right now. If you haven't yet listened to part 1, it's highly suggested so that all of this makes some kind of sense because it's a cluster. We left off at an incredibly chaotic scene. Michele MacNeill is dead. She's been found in the bathtub of her Pleasant Grove home by her 6-year-old daughter, by the way. And 6-year-old Ada said that there was about 1/4 of an inch of water in the tub. But now the water has been drained, and there's questions. There's so many questions. Her husband, yes, her husband, the doctor, the lawyer, the bishop, Martin MacNeill, is behaving in a way that just defies every single social norm you would expect from a grieving spouse. His call to 911 easily could be called overacting, and him giving the wrong address to his own home to 911, causing delays. He attempted CPR, but a neighbor who was there while waiting for the paramedics noticed that Michelle's chest didn't rise or fall as he's doing this. He was faking it. And then he yells at Michele as if it were all her fault for having a facelift surgery. You know, the surgery that he basically bullied her into getting in the first place. But he wanted that scene. He wanted the neighbors to see him acting the way that he was. But now is where the story shifts. In part 1, we learned how it was all a setup. The image of the perfect family, the pressure for Michele to get a facelift, the strange cocktail of drugs for recovery. And speaking of recovery, the recovery from hell, right? Tonight, we're going to take a look at the whole unraveling of Martin's story. The real horror show is what comes after, what happened next. The cover-up, the investigation, the ego of this man and his deception. How did he almost, yes, almost, get away with it? And how did his own children, especially his grown daughters, eventually bring him down? Just to orient everyone listening, this is pulled from a massive stack of documents, a mountain of evidence. The amended autopsy report from 2010, the 2013 trial transcripts, affidavits for search warrants, and even prison records regarding Martin. But we have to take this one step at a time, and we've got to start with that first hurdle. The thing that almost stopped justice before it even had a chance. And this would be the initial ruling. The medical examiner gave an initial ruling after Michele had passed. And you would think that a healthy woman, just 50 years old, who drowns in a bathtub after a facelift screams suspicious, right? You'd think that the immediate reaction for the police would be, okay, lock down the crime scene, secure it, no one in or out, right? But that's not what happened at all. The initial ruling was natural causes. Natural. And this is the kind of thing that just flat out shuts down an investigation. Dr. Maureen Frick was the original medical examiner, and in May of 2007, she signs a report saying that Michele died of cardiovascular disease, specifically chronic hypertension and myocarditis. So let's break that down a second for everyone. That's inflammation of the heart muscle. It's usually viral, and yes, in theory, it can cause sudden death. It can disrupt the heart's electrical rhythms. Scary, right? But here's the catch, and this is where Martin's background as a doctor becomes weaponized. The sources say that Martin was feeding data to Dr. Frick before the autopsy was even complete. He was talking to the medical examiner during the process, telling her and the investigators that Michele had high blood pressure She wasn't taking her meds, and she had a history of heart issues. He told her that he found Michele, quote, slumped over the tub with her face completely submerged in the water. And if you remember what Ada, the little 6-year-old, said, as well as what the neighbor said about Michele being in the tub face up, this just doesn't add up. He told the medical examiner that her legs and feet were outside the tub. The faucet wasn't running, the water was cool, the water in the tub was cool, and that her pajama bottoms were in the master bedroom next to the bed. But again, Ada describes seeing her mom fully clothed. By the time the neighbors got there, Michele had no clothing on from the waist down. It kind of makes you wonder if he just didn't want Ada to see her mom naked, and when he sent her away to get the neighbors, he stripped off her pants. Martin continues to feed information to Dr. Frick, saying he first lifted her head, checked for a pulse and found none, pulled the drain plug, and then began rescue breathing, telling her that he saw some foam coming from Michele's nose. He's setting the entire narrative before the science has even had a chance to speak for itself. He is essentially diagnosing his own wife for the medical examiner. Dr. Frick, tragically, passed away in 2008. So we don't know what her exact thought process was, but it's strongly suggested that she relied heavily on the history provided by Martin, who just happened to be a physician. A doctor tells you his wife had a heart condition, and then you see some minor scarring or inflammation of the heart, which, by the way, isn't uncommon in a 50-year-old, and you tend to connect those dots. You assume the husband is telling the truth. He's wearing the doctor hat, so he must be right. And that ruling of natural causes essentially freezes everything. Police don't generally investigate natural deaths as murders. And nothing more really needs to be looked at. There's no crime, according to the medical examiner, so nothing is done. Martin is free to continue on completely unchecked. He's just the grieving husband, or, that's the role he was supposed to play. But he didn't do it very well. Take Michele's funeral. At a place like this, you would expect people to be devastated, especially her husband. He should be broken. Here is someone he spent the last 30 years of his life with. But that's not what the attendees saw. Witnesses would later describe what they heard or saw, and it's jarring, to say the least. Neighbors and family members who attended the funeral described this bizarre behavior by Martin. Let's unpack this bachelor joke, because this sticks out like a sore thumb. People who saw Martin described him as unusually happy. He was greeting people, shaking hands, almost giddy. And he made a specific comment to several people about how odd it was to be a bachelor again. At his wife's funeral, who says that? Nobody grieving says that. It sounds like relief, not sadness, like someone who has just successfully completed a project. It suggests that Michele wasn't a person. She was just an obstacle that he removed, but he's now free. He had to play the part for the bigger audience. So we see this wild turn from giddy bachelor to the frail widower, which next brings us to the cane. This is one of those details that feels like it's from a bad made-for-TV movie, but it's right there in the affidavits. We talked a bit about his supposed health issues in part 1, how he claimed to have cancer or MS, depending on who he was talking to. That performance continued right into the funeral. It's all about stage management with this guy. Before the service, Martin was actually seen running. Yes, literally running between the church and his car. Witnesses saw this. No limp, No cane, no assistance whatsoever. But then the audience arrives. And as guests start pulling into the lot for the funeral, the performance starts. He takes out the cane and starts to limp heavily. He transforms instantly into this frail, sick widower who could barely stand. He wants sympathy, but it's also very tactical. He wants to look weak, so no one suspects that he had the physical capability to drown his wife. Like, look at me, I can barely walk. How could I possibly overpower a grown woman? It's a physical alibi. But then he gets up to speak at the service. And this is where you're left with questions. The sermon barely mentions Michele. That's what stood out to everyone in the room. He talked about himself, his brothers, and then he started telling these stories, these messed up stories about his family history. And he starts listing off suicides like a roll call of death. He talks about his brother, Roy, and this is chilling because later this connects to other evidence. He tells the congregation that his mother found Roy dead with a needle in his arm. He talks about another brother who drank himself to death, and then a sister who strangled herself. He was framing his family as cursed, as people who self-destruct. Then there's a piece of evidence from a mistress. Now, we talked about the long-term mistress, Gypsy, in the first episode, and she's still around. But even while he's seeing Gypsy, he had another mistress, Anna. Anna later told investigators that years earlier, Martin had confessed to her that he had actually killed his brother, Roy. He claimed that Roy was suicidal and an embarrassment to the family, and claimed that he found Roy in a bathtub with his wrist cut, but he wasn't dying fast enough. Martin claimed he held his brother's head underwater. Yeah, put that together. And years later, this is how his wife dies. And now he's talking about this brother who died the same way at his wife's funeral. It's almost as if he's playing this game with everyone. Was this true? We don't know if it was, or if it was just another lie to impress yet another mistress. But we do know that he brought it up at Michele's funeral. How disturbing is that? Now, Anna is no longer part of the picture. Gypsy is now his main mistress, and we have to talk about this because Michele dies on April 11th. The funeral is on April 14th. 3 days later, April 17th, is when he takes his daughter to sit outside the LDS temple. And for those who aren't familiar, the temple is a sacred space in the Mormon faith. It's a place for serious spiritual reflection. But Martin takes his daughter there and tells her that they're going to pray for help for the younger children. He says that he can't do it alone. Even though Rachel, one of the oldest daughters, has quit her job to take care of the younger children, and Alexis, not too far behind Rachel, has offered to stay home and do the same. But Martin wants to pray for a nanny. And miraculously, a woman walks up to them, approaches, and says how sorry she is for their loss. She says she was at the funeral and introduces herself as Jillian, says that she's a nursing student, and Martin acts like he's never seen this woman before in his life. Completely plays dumb, plays the role of the grateful widower. Oh, thank you, what a blessing. He exchanges numbers with her right there. Rachel, the daughter who was with him at the time, said the whole thing felt scripted, and she was right. Because this wasn't some stranger. It was Gypsy, the mistress that Martin had been seeing since 2005. The same woman he'd been texting dozens of times a day leading up to the murder. The same woman whose texts he was checking during the funeral service itself. So Martin brings her into the fold under this fake name, Jillian. Now, some records indicate that he actually used her full name of Gypsy Willis during a family meeting where he's introducing her as their new nanny. But we're going to stick with just Jillian. And Jillian moves in within 9 days to 2 weeks after Michele has died. She moves in as the new nanny. This was the cover story. The older daughters, though, Alexis and Rachel, saw through it right away. And Alexis knew she recognized the name. She notes this profound moment of epiphany. About a month before her mom died, she had gotten her dad's T-Mobile password and, along with her mom, reviewed his phone records online. Michele was suspicious, and Alexis helped her do the digging. And one phone number in particular was called by Martin all hours of the day and night. Later, she did a background search on this number and discovered it belonged to Gypsy Jillian Willis. In part 1, we know that Michele confronted him, and he said that she was just a tenant in one of his rental properties. That's all. Imagine the environment in that house. Everyone, well, almost everyone, is deeply grieving. Their mother has just been buried, and here's this stranger who moves in and is supposed to help. But the kids notice. She doesn't cook. She doesn't clean. She didn't really watch the kids. The kids were often left alone while Martin and the nanny were behind closed doors in the master bedroom, the same area of the home where their mom had just died. I mean, how do you even describe this? It's so brazen that words escape you. Martin no longer feels like he has to hide this. But Alexis and Rachel, they know this is wrong. They know this is all off. They also know that no one, the police especially, are going to look into this any further. You know how sometimes your brain protects you from the truth because it's too horrible to process? Once that dam breaks, though, everything floods in. The odd things, the pressure of the facelift, the drugs, the way the body was found, the sudden appearance of the nanny. It all clicked into place. And once that switch was flipped, Alexis and Rachel looked at things very differently. So they became their own detectives. They fully believed that their own father had set this whole thing up and murdered their mom so that Gypsy could take her place. And they start digging. Something's up. They get their hands on the phone records again, which was so crucial. They find calls to Gypsy at all hours of the night and realize that they're onto something. They confront Martin about this, and of course, he doesn't apologize. Of course not. He doesn't explain. He does what he always does when he's found out, and he fights. He attacks. He kicks Alexis and Rachel out of the house. And not only that, he forbids them from even contacting the younger kids. He's isolating the older children from the younger ones, which is terrifying. That gives him absolute control over the narrative. And this obviously didn't sit well with the girls. So together, they launch a years-long campaign to expose their father and his lies. Alexis knew about her mom's suspicions. She knew about the phone calls. They had records of these calls, but they still had the hurdle of the medical examiner's report that Michele died of natural causes. But they had to keep digging. The local Pleasant Grove police had closed Michele's case as a natural death. So the girls had to come up with other ideas, and they visited every newspaper in Utah and hounded the governor's office and the Utah County Attorney's office, begging someone to listen to their suspicions about their dad. Michele's sister, Linda, also helped. She, too, had her own suspicions, and she compiled an extensive file documenting Martin's past, the lifelong history of deception, his falsified medical and law school transcripts, his forgery spree, and his military discharge. We talked about this in part 1. Linda, Michelle's sister, visited a detective at the Pleasant Grove, Utah Police Department and was told that the police department was closing the case, saying how sorry they were because she was so young to have a heart attack. The girls and Linda even hired their own private investigator when no one took them seriously. That same month, Martin and Gypsy get a marriage license, but they never marry. It's a fake license. But here's something that's going to send your stomach churning. The date of their fake marriage on the certificate, it is the same day as Michelle's funeral. In the meantime, the girls and Linda are still doing their own investigation. For 5 years, they spoke to anyone who would listen about what they had discovered. Remember the bathroom when Michelle was found? We need to revisit that dry floor contradiction, because in the affidavits, this is a major point of contention. Martin told the 911 dispatcher and the neighbors who came over to help that he had struggled to pull Michelle out of the tub, said she was slippery and heavy. Water was splashing everywhere. He painted a picture of this frantic, chaotic, wet struggle. But the physical evidence said something else. The first neighbor to arrive, Angie, rushed in to help and noticed that the floor was bone dry. Let's just talk about that. The physics of that don't add up. If water is being displaced aggressively, it's going to end up on the floor. He said he was trying to wrestle her out of the tub. And Martin is wearing street clothes. He should have been soaked, but he wasn't. This implies that the scene was staged or altered before anyone ever arrived. That this struggle didn't happen when he said it did, if it happened at all. Then, on the 911 call, he stalled. He gave the wrong address initially, which bought him time. Time to dry the floor. Time to dress the body. And remember, Ada was the first one to see her mom in the tub, and she was fully clothed according to her. Neighbors said she had nothing on from the waist down when they saw her. And then Martin claims that Michelle was slumped head first into the water like she passed out or had an accident or a sudden heart attack. But here's the thing, the lividity. This tells a completely different story. I mean, not only do we have the neighbors and little Ada seeing Michelle in a completely different position, there's this lividity. Lividity is where the blood goes in your body after you die. It's where it pools. Gravity pulls the blood down to the lowest point. The heart stops pumping, so it's just like any other fluid. It's subject to gravity. If you die on your back, the blood pools in your back and buttocks. It causes this purplish discoloration, and once it sits, it's fixed. Then there's the issue of the pills. We talked about how Martin used his doctor title to essentially bully the plastic surgeon into prescribing this cocktail of drugs that he normally wouldn't have. Right after returning from the hospital and after Michelle had been pronounced dead, Martin orders his son and his girlfriend to get rid of the pills. He tells them to flush them down the toilet. He couldn't bear to look at them. The girlfriend, though, later testified that before she flushed them, she noticed that some of the bottles were nearly empty, and they had just been filled days before. The math wasn't mathing. If Michelle had taken them as prescribed, there should have been plenty left. This suggests two things. Either Michelle took a massive overdose on her own, and she was always very, very careful about prescriptions, or Martin administered them to her. Martin also got rid of the paper trail. Alexis had this little black book, right? She was diligent. She was logging every single pill that Michelle took. This book would have been the definitive hour-by-hour record of what Michele actually did consume versus what was missing from the bottles. But the book just vanished, disappeared from the house immediately after Michele died. It was never found. So the pills are flushed, the logbook is gone, and Martin does whatever he can do to scrub the scene. But let's fast forward now to just 3 months after Michele's death. This is, oh God, not only bizarre, but so heartbreaking. The identity fraud. So again, it's 3 months after Michele has died. Martin forces his 16-year-old daughter, Giselle, to return to the Ukraine. Remember, from part 1, they had adopted several children from there. Martin told her it was for a summer visit to visit her biological sister, and he told Alexis to go with her. And if she didn't, she would never be able to see her younger siblings again. She was also told to keep Giselle's U.S. passport because she might lose it. This is in July. In the meantime, Giselle is in the Ukraine. Alexis has returned from essentially dropping her off. And for nearly a year, Giselle is abandoned there. Yeah, he abandoned one of his own children. She had no money for food or school for several months. Why? Well, because during this time, Gypsy assumes Giselle's identity. Gypsy has piss poor credit and tons of debt and a checkered past of her own. She needed a fresh start. So Martin, the loving father, creates false documents, turning Gypsy Willis into Jillian Giselle MacNeill. That's sociopathic. You dump your daughter in a foreign country just so your mistress can use your credit score. It perfectly connects to the fraud theme that we see throughout his entire life. Fake medical school transcripts, faked military discharge. Martin MacNeill wasn't just a murderer. He was a career con man. He thought he could swap his daughter's identity just as easily as he swapped his wife for a mistress. When the girls realize what has happened with Giselle, they have to speak through interpreters in the Ukraine just to get their sister back. In the meantime, Alexis knew that her other younger siblings were not safe, and she fought a bitter legal battle for years for custody. It wasn't until 2008 that Martin gave up his parental rights and Alexis became the sole provider of 4 children. After years of letters sent to the Utah County Attorney's Office and then Governor John Huntsman Jr., after visiting every single paper in Utah to get someone to listen, and after creating a comprehensive file on their father that spanned 30 years, someone finally took notice. Veteran Utah County Attorney's Office investigator Doug Whitney took interest. He and another investigator, Jeff Robinson, were drawn in by this family's persistence and the documentation that they had. Because Martin was a respected doctor and attorney, authorities had initially failed to question him properly. Surprise, surprise. While this is happening, because you know damn well that Martin is aware of all of this, he pulls out the schizophrenic card. Because, years earlier, this is when he was sort of diagnosed by the Army, which is why he was discharged. He likely just faked it to get benefits. He knows the walls are closing in. The strange behavior at the funeral, the hiring of the nanny, it was just him dealing with his mental illness. I'm not a killer, I'm just crazy. In 2010, though, everything changed. Michele was exhumed. This, yes, was terrible trauma for the family. Just the emotional toll of having to do that. But it was necessary. Dr. Todd Gray, the chief medical examiner, reviewed the case. He looks at the toxicology and he sees something that the initial medical examiner missed, or because she was being led by Martin, who was this respected guy, just didn't look into. So a new manner of death is then added to the report. It is formally changed from natural to undetermined. He states that the cause of death included the combined effects of heart disease and drug toxicity from 4 medications: Valium, Percocet, Phenergan, and Ambien, that Martin had administered to Michele. This now kicks the door wide open because now police have a medical ruling that clearly says that drugs played a role. And let's talk about those drugs again, that drug cocktail. We listed them in part 1, but let's look at how they all work together. All of them individually and at the levels found, maybe none of them kill her outright. A defense attorney would say, look, the oxy level wasn't lethal. But Dr. Gray, the medical examiner, says to look at the combination. It's how they interact. Phenergan is anti-nausea medication, but it also makes opioids hit much stronger. Ambien knocks you out. Valium relaxes the muscles, and when you put them all together, you get a profound central nervous system depression. Michele couldn't fight back. She likely couldn't even lift her head. If she slipped under the water, she wouldn't have the normal reflex to pull herself up and gasp for air. It wasn't a violent drowning with thrashing and splashing. It was a silent drowning, aided by a drug cocktail. This explains the low levels of water in her lungs compared to a typical violent drowning. With the cause of death changed, and now the fraud case building on the side, the taking of his own daughter's identity, the legal system finally grabbed Martin MacNeill. Now, at first, he goes to prison for the fraud, for the Giselle and Gypsy identity theft. And this is actually a pretty brilliant move by the prosecutors. They used the fraud, which was easy to prove thanks to the extensive paper trail, to get him off the street and take him away from his resources. He's lost everything: his medical license, his law license, the standing he had in the community. When he walks out of prison in 2012, he's immediately arrested for murder. Which brings us to the trial in 2013. This was a massive trial that lasted weeks, and it was a battle of the experts. The prosecution brings in Dr. Joshua Perper. He argued strongly for a drowning, pointing to heavy lungs heavy with fluid and water in the stomach, telling jurors that this is not a heart attack. This is a woman who inhaled water. Naturally, the defense had their own experts, and they stuck to the heart theory, the myocarditis theory, arguing that her heart just stopped. They tried to create reasonable doubt by saying that you can't provide definitively that she drowned. It's hard to prove 100%, but the circumstantial evidence surrounding it was just so overwhelming. And then Gypsy takes the stand. This was a highly anticipated moment, but she wasn't a cooperative witness for the state. She was declared a hostile witness, still protecting Martin after everything. Even though she was hostile, her testimony was damaging. She had to admit to the affair. She had to admit to the text messages, had to admit to the fake nanny arrangement and the ring. We have to mention the ring. She admitted that Martin proposed to her with a $7,000 diamond ring shortly after Michele died. All this while he's telling the kids that they need to save money while they're grieving the loss of their mother. It just shows his priorities so clearly that it totally destroys this grieving husband image for the jury. Then came the jailhouse snitches, the inmates. And this kind of testimony is always a little sketchy. You have guys trying to get reduced sentences by saying whatever the cops want to hear. What they said, though, was incredibly specific. An inmate testified that Martin was outright bragging, claimed that Martin said, "Bitches are like that," referring to how women react to drugs. That is so cold. It suggests, though, that he knew of the physiological reaction that Michele would have. Another inmate claimed that Martin said that investigators were just too stupid to catch him because he was a doctor. The ER doctor that we mentioned in part 1, Dr. Von Wegener, the guy that Martin yelled at to don't quit, he testified that Martin actually offered him this $10,000 to not quit his resuscitation efforts. A grief-stricken bargaining, a guy losing his mind, right? But in light of the murder charge, the experts and the jury thought very differently. It looked like a calculated transaction. Like Martin is thinking, if I pay this guy to keep going, no one can say I didn't try to save her. It was a performance, a $10,000 prop for his play. Or perhaps maybe he realized, oh no, if she dies right now, do I look guilty? I need to look like I'm trying everything possible. Yeah, it wasn't about saving Michele. It was about saving Martin. The jury goes into deliberation November 9th, 2013. They deliberate for 11 hours, which is quite a bit of time. They were being thorough. When they did come back, they came back with a guilty verdict: first-degree murder and obstruction of justice. The daughters were weeping. Michele's sister was weeping. This was absolute relief. They had done it. This guy was going to get what he deserved. He wasn't going to get off scot-free. And Martin, how did he react? Well, evidently stone cold. He didn't flinch. He just turned to his lawyer and said, it's okay. No tears, no anger, just emptiness. We move now to 2017. Martin has been in prison for a couple of years, 3 years. He's serving his life sentence and is found dead in the outdoor yard of the prison. Suicide. He used a disposable razor and dismantled it. And you have to wonder if this was his final act of absolute control. You know, I think you can easily argue that he was a man who needed to be the director of the play at all times. He controlled his wife's own face, her medication, his children's lives. He tried to control the legal system. And when he was finally somewhere that he couldn't control, he decided to control his exit. And what about Gypsy? Well, following this investigation into Michele's death, she was convicted of several crimes and served time in both federal and state custody. In 2009, she pleaded guilty to 1 count of aggravated identity theft. She was sentenced to 21 months in federal prison. She was actually arrested earlier than she was supposed to have been and ordered to start her sentence after it was found out that she was planning to flee to Mexico. In May of 2011, she was then sentenced in state court to 36 months of probation for identity fraud and giving false statements. She was arrested again in 2012 for violating her probation because investigators found out that she wasn't living at her registered address. I have no idea where she is today, and frankly, don't care. Martin denied his daughters the satisfaction of him rotting in a cell for 20 years. But he didn't get the last word. This belongs to his daughters and to Michele's sister, Linda. We really need to recognize the immense costs they paid to get justice for Michele. They had to dismantle their entire family, hunt their own father. In the end, they lost both parents, one to murder and one to the truth. It redefines heroism. It wasn't just standing up to a killer. It was tearing down this perfect family facade. The church, the medical degree, the adoptions. Martin used all these as props, and he hid behind his titles. So as we wrap this up, what does that leave us with? For me, it raises a very unsettling question about trust. You know, we are deeply conditioned to trust certain uniforms. We trust the doctor with the white coat to give us the right pills. We trust the religious leader to have a solid moral compass. Martin was both, and he used all that trust as a weapon. He assumed that because of who he was or who he pretended to be, no one would ever dare to look beyond that. And they didn't for a long time. It forces us to wonder how many other Martin MacNeills are operating right now, totally shielded by a title and a nice suit. It's a terrifying thought to end on, but, a necessary one. Trust but verify, especially when the floor is dry and the stories don't add up. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining me in this two-part series of the MacNeill case. It's been heavy and shocking for sure, but also an incredibly important one. I'll see you next week. Bye for now.